welcome, everyone. I am here with Dr. Gabriele Hilberg, who I've had the pleasure of knowing for close to 30 years. Before we get started, I'd like to give people a little bit of background about your work. Dr. Gabriele Hilberg has been a psychotherapist and psychonaut for over 30 years. Educated in both Germany and the United States, she has spoken at international conferences and workshops globally. As she integrates new research and profound insights from psychedelics with her clients, which we're going to talk about today, she sees the strong need to push the boundaries of professional dogmas. Her psychedelic training has uprooted her fundamental understanding of psychopathology, the process of psychotherapy, and her role as a therapist. And she loves speaking on podcasts and conferences about her passion of bringing both traditional psychotherapy and psychedelics together. And boy, what a time to be talking about that now with so many changes that are occurring in the world today.
Yes. Thank you, Renee, for inviting me. And this is a very special moment because we are going to talk about change and also the resistance to change. That is a topic that is very difficult for therapists to talk about because it points out our own limits of what we can do. And it also keeps us humble because we are trained to help people initiate change and live their change. And then there are times when people say they want to change, but something deeply inside that's typically unknown to them holds them back.
It's almost like an intellectual understanding kind of comes up to the surface. So they realize from a rational mind what they need to do, but then putting it into motion is where the blockages start to happen.
Yes. And also, we are at a time where we talk a lot about trauma and we become aware of how much trauma can throw us off and change our lives in severe ways. With the emphasis on trauma, we also have an overuse of the word trauma in middle school and high school, at least in California. Kids talk a lot about having been traumatized by this, by that, by a test that they weren't prepared for, or an incident at school, or they talk about being traumatized by their parents. So being traumatized is almost like something that everyone has experienced, small trauma, big trauma. But while there are excellent ways of now helping people who have experienced trauma to overcome it, there's also a shadow side to having been traumatized that people are sometimes not aware of, that trauma creates actually a trauma identity. We can talk more about that as we go along.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. And I actually love that term too, because I resonate with it. It just makes sense. What I'd love to know, however, is it's been a long path for you to get here. And certainly when you started your work way back in the day, right? I mean, you say that you've been a psychonaut for 30 years. 30 years ago, it was a very different landscape. So I'd love to hear what really started you on your path to do psychotherapy. What was the impetus that said, I want to commit my life to doing this?
It was very obvious. I started the work of a psychotherapist when I was 15, but I didn't know what I was doing. I was in an all-girls Catholic nun school. And around age 15 or so, several of my friends wanted to talk about their problems. And I only had recess time. That was 35 minutes a day. And I had more requests than I had time slots, 5 during the week. And so I would bring in a calendar on Monday, and people would write in their name what was their time to talk. And I did this for basically 3 years. When we were on field trips from the psychology department with overnight stays in youth hostels, I gave talks on the meaning of life. And I don't know what I said, but they always wanted like a second night to hear more. And I didn't think anything of it. The teachers didn't know. My parents didn't know. And I continued when I was going to college. We had individual rooms, and I pretty soon had put a calendar on the outside of my door with time slots for people to put their names in. And they did. In my 4th year in college, I had 2 professors who wanted to come and have a session. Now, that was a little weird. It was not anything sexual or anything, but that was outside of my belief system of what I was doing. I was just talking and listening. And then in my last semester at the university, we had a weekend seminar in a castle. That's what, a small castle, but a real castle. And we took the 𝐦𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐿 empathy test. And then the teacher put on the whiteboard all of our scores. And there was somebody who had to score 100 out of 100. And I remember thinking, my God, some people are good in math, in science. Oh, that's really something. I didn't know that was even something one could be good at. And the professor took me aside and said, Gabrielle, that's your score. I think, you become a therapist. That's the first time I heard that there was a profession like that.
Wow.
But then in Germany, you have to have 7 years of Latin to be able to study psychology, because it's supposed to be a science. And I didn't have that, and I was not going to go to night school. So when I later, it was 5, 6 years later, I heard that in the US, you could just pay for going to college and study psychology. And I had an offer to come here and live with a trainer. And I had never for a minute thought about moving to the States. It was not appealing to me at all. But I thought about it for 3 days, and it was a clear yes. It was not excitement. It was not fear. It was just truth.
When you started your work, the word trauma really wasn't a thing as it has become today with the onslaught of so many videos and courses and workshops on it, and the rise of Dr. Gabor Mate's work, and so on and so on. And so, but you've always really worked with trauma, whether you called it shadow work or some of the traditional terminology, but now it's really coming up to the surface.
Yes.
I think to be healed in a way that we've never seen before.
Yes.
Why do you think that's happening?
I think that we started having EMDR, that's the eye movement desensitization and reprocessing work by Shapiro. And she discovered it by chance, but then it lent itself very well to research. And so in 2004, I learned in a 4-day seminar, EMDR, and you move your hand so that the client can follow your hand with their eyeballs, and it creates the same eye movement as we have during REM sleep. And during REM sleep, we process everyday trauma. And so the technique requires that the client talks about the traumatic event, and we do the eye movement and then pause and let the next level come up. And it's highly effective. I was so excited when I learned the technique. One of the trainers lives here in Santa Clara, so I asked her if I could come. I did 2 years of an hour and a half weekly EMDR work. And with her, I went from my birth to everything that I could remember was the slightest traumatic growing up. It was amazing. I was in seventh heaven, having learned it and then experienced it. And when I went to an advanced course in EMDR, there were about 60 therapists, and the trainer asked, who has experienced EMDR work for themselves? I raised my hand. I was the only one. I was floored. I was floored because you have to experience that trauma can be healed by this very simple method. But it is true that many therapists intellectually learn how to work with people, but they don't have a real experience themselves.
Yeah, well said. And I think I remember growing up, right? And I'm sure you remember the same thing. If you dealt with trauma, whether it was big trauma coming back from the Vietnam War, whether you had been sexually molested or raped, or, or a death in the family. I mean, trauma, there's so many different layers to it. And I don't know about you in Europe, but certainly in New England, in the United States, right? We shoved it under the carpet. We didn't talk about it.
Yeah.
One of those things that, you just shoved under. And I think that now it seems, not to say that it's cool to address our trauma, but it's safe. It feels
Yes.
safer than ever before because people are saying, I need to look at that. It's destroying my relationship or it's destroying my happiness. So let's talk about that from the essence of, people, when they hear the word trauma, sometimes they think of something big like PTSD, but how do you actually define trauma?
Well, trauma is not the event. Trauma is our response to the event, what we make it mean. So, for example, in a family of, 5 kids, the house gets burglarized. And 3 kids don't remember it in adulthood at all. One remembers, yeah, I remember it vaguely. And another one goes, oh my God, this was the most terrifying event in my childhood. And so our trauma response, what we make it mean, how we interpret the world that this can happen, and what it means about the people that are supposed to keep us safe, and what it means that this can happen to me, what it means about having control in life and in the world. So that's where people can have a quite different reaction to the same event. And so it's important that we distinguish that, because not all bad things that happen in life create a trauma response.
So in your more traditional line of work, when you're doing talk therapy,
Mm-hmm.
Over time, and you hear this all the time. I mean, you hear both sides. You hear some people say, you know what, if it wasn't for my therapist, I wouldn't be here today. Or if it wasn't for my therapist, I wouldn't have been able to get out of bed again and go back to work and have a functional life. And then you hear the flip side of, I've been going to traditional therapy for 20 years, and my friends say I'm no further ahead.
Mm-hmm.
So why do people not heal, emotionally and physically, even when they're in therapy and they're signing up and they're committed to making their lives better?
Yes, that is a kind of a bewildering phenomena, because when we are traumatized by something, first of all, some people deny that they were impacted by an event. they have a need to go, well, I'm resilient. It wasn't that bad. I have a good job. I'm married. Life is moving on, and I don't want to be impacted by it. So the trauma response is actually in our nervous system. This is why no amount of just talking about it or sharing the event or thinking about it helps to release that trauma response from the body. So, for example, when I was in my EMDR training, we were to practice on each other. And we were to pick an event that had been traumatic. And I knew exactly what I wanted to pick. It was a rainy night on 17 between Santa Cruz and San Jose. I had a new red sports car for a week. And there was a huge, huge pile up. We had stood, crawling forward for over an hour and a half. So there was a big accident. The ambulances were there, the police was there. Finally, the congestion opened up. And about a mile and a half later, 2 cars in front of me collided on the wet pavement or something. And it blocked the entire traffic from passing on. It was right behind the curve. So nobody coming to this curve was aware of the pileup. I was the first car behind the cars that had collided. And there was no side strip. I was sitting there like a lame duck. And in my rear mirror, I watched about 20 cars coming and piling up, the banging, I was shaking. I was praying so hard, like never before in my life. And they came this close to my car. That was the only undamaged car.
Wow.
The pushing of the cars, the banging opened up the 2 cars in front of me so I could leave, and I knew the police and the ambulances were right there. For about 3.5 years before my EMDR training, every time I saw a sudden brake light in front of me, unexpected, I would break out in sweat before I could even think. Now, that is a typical trauma response.
Yeah.
And it was outside of my control, this reaction. So that is typical when the trauma response is in your nervous system. You get jumpy. You are expecting something like that happened in the trauma to occur again. Like when you walk around a corner, there could be a person standing there ready to ambush you, or somebody taking your wallet, if that had been the trauma reaction. So what we do is we see life then through the filter of trauma. And because we want to be safe, we narrow it down.
Yeah.
Right? And that's how we cope. And so sometimes people are not aware of having a trauma response, but their life gets more and more and more narrow. They forget the original event, and then they just go, well, life is just that way for me. So that's how trauma can get buried and then becomes not processed out, and we remain restricted.
So this leads me to a really great segue into the traumatic event itself, because for everyone it's different, as you say, and then over time it gets buried. So we see this all the time where there was an event in childhood. They start defining themselves by their trauma. I mean, you hear it with, oh, I must have had bad karma in this lifetime. There must have been something I did in a past life to result in so much bad luck happening this time. I mean, we hear that all the time. Or, I was beaten by my father and saw my mother thrown down the stairs. And so because of that, that sense of helplessness kind of follows them. And they define themselves by their trauma through story, through whatever it is, through their behavior. What's actually happening here?
Well, when we have experienced trauma, like when I tell my story about the car pileup on 17, actually, there is another deeper level here. In my EMDR training, what turned out to be the real trauma, that what shook me, was I knew about fate, but I never had seen fate happen. I knew that no matter how good the drivers were, the safety of the cars, they were in it. There was no way out. And that is what the actual trauma response was for me. And from that piece of work I did in the training, my breaking out in cold sweat stopped instantly.
Wow.
So that's what we mean by there's an event, but then what makes it a trauma is by how we interpret it, what it means to us. And that way of being out of control in life, I had never fully experienced like I did that night on Highway 17.
Wow.
So when we are having experienced difficult times, it can be a difficult childhood or a specific difficult event, and we tell the story to others, the response is one of compassion. Because we give compassion, because that supports and helps the person who is suffering. For some people, it's the first time in their life that they have gotten that much compassion, that much attention. And so they begin to identify and cling to that story because inadvertently it gets people to treat them nicely, to treat them with allowances that you are not quite capable like other people are. And people like that. So when they are starved for attention in their life prior to the trauma, or just growing up with very little attention and compassion, this is a very positive event. In preparing for our talk today, I looked up the books I have on my bookshelf, and I found again the book by Carolyn Myss on Why People Don't Heal, from 1997. And I still had my markups in the book from that time. It's an amazing topic because it's painful as a therapist to see that you do the best that you can, what you have learned, what your intuition tells you where to go, what to focus on. And then some people don't change. And, and then we go, well, maybe I overlooked something, maybe we try again. And particularly when the person comes back session after session, you go, wow, the person is willing to be here and pay, and let's try again. So in her book, she gives some very interesting examples of situations that she has experienced when she has talked in the public about why people don't heal. And one of her examples that she cites is about a lecture she gave at the University of New Hampshire. And she talked about why people don't heal and how they are identified with their trauma, and that they talk woundology, a term that she coined, that they love talking about their wounds.
Yeah.
And in the question and answer period, there was a woman sitting there, and she shot up like, electrified, and said, well, if you are saying I should stop talking about my trauma, my wound, what else do I have to say? Yeah. This is don't take that away from me. I don't like at all what you are saying. She was mad. So often people meet like in support groups, which are great, and they bond around their trauma. And when you are healed, you have to leave the group. Or when you have overcome the trauma, what do you talk about at a gathering, right? I only talk about this experience on Highway 17 whenever I have to talk about trauma. But otherwise, I'm not bringing that up at a social gathering, a party, or hanging out with some friends. It's in the past. It's no longer a topic. Carolyn cites another example of a woman who tragically lost her daughter in a car accident. And she was grieving, and it was totally understandable that she was just torn apart by the event. I think there's nothing worse than losing a child. Yeah. And yet, several years afterwards, the woman was still bringing up the story about having lost her daughter, exactly when other people, friends, would challenge her, like, hey, get a life. You don't have to just sit at home. And sure, you did a lot of grieving, you had tremendous loss, but come with us, let's go to the movies. And she would then angrily say, you have no idea what it's like to have lost a daughter. And then people would apologize, going, oh, I'm sorry, I did not want to minimize your pain. And she, even before the daughter got killed, had a great need for attention. Yeah. And so this need for attention and having control over a social setting, how other people respond, how they are supposed to be, how they're supposed to treat you, she started using that as a new layer that developed over time. And she had no idea how manipulative she had become.
You know, it's interesting because I think you and I originally met, I thought it was in Silicon Valley, but I actually think it was at a Tony Robbins event 1,000 years ago now. And so you know his training also. And there was a point where he talked about NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, and how a key part of lasting change, at least through that modality, was that if you don't replace the pain or the need for the attention, a need for whatever, with something greater than it.
Yes.
And, to turn on all the serotonin and the feel and the dopamine, everything that you need to feel good or to feel safe or to feel accepted, to feel loved, then it's never going to change. Right. As just one example.
So here's, after a trauma occurs, that can be also an illness or a stroke or a house burning down, then the layer of personality that existed before for the person gets activated. And some people are terrified of any change. And change is difficult for everyone. And we only move forward when it's worse staying the way we are. So many people who don't let trauma go have a belief that the future will be worse than where they're at right now. At least they know the pain, they know their limitations, they know the small living that they are doing. But what's outside of that is perceived as more scary. That living a full life, even though you're handicapped in some ways, or you will always have the loss you experienced over the loss of a child, that does not look as appealing because change is difficult and healing means we have to change.
So anyway, let's talk about Carolyn's 5 myths.
Yes.
interfere with a person's ability to change, since we're talking about behavior change, and the healing process. So she has 5 of them. Number 1, my life is defined by my wound. Number 2, being healthy means being alone. Number 3, feeling pain means being destroyed by pain. Number 4, trauma is bad and we are damaged at the core.
Mhm.
And number 5, true change is impossible.
Yes.
So can you describe your experience with these 5 myths and how it plays out in your own work?
Yes. So let's take the last one. True change is not possible. Because I'm from Europe, I get a high number of European clients. And the same is true for East Coast clients. I have to add a year and a half to therapy when they come from Europe or from the East Coast.
Yeah.
Because the belief that change is possible is very low. I mean, they go, yeah, but I am who I am. How can I change? This is my personality. And I'm like, no, your personality is a cluster of stories. It's a cluster of beliefs. And by holding the stories and the belief, including the belief that change is not really possible, you're not changing. And people are frightened by the fact that there might not be as a solid personality as they have thought themselves to be. And so here's a tricky thing. It's like when you are experiencing pain and trauma, that's your reality right now. And you know it and you feel it. And having any belief that life could be different, you could have a happy life again, maybe limited, but happy, adventuresome, creative. That's about the future. And it's intangible. But what you feel right now is real. And so they cannot imagine and don't want to imagine something that is vague or is just like a promise. But they go, no, no, no. I know who I am and how I feel right now, which is true. It takes a leap of faith. It takes sometimes the stories of other people that have experienced similar trauma and hearing their stories and how they have overcome it and what their life is now like is extremely helpful to foster the belief that it's also possible for me. But then some people unconsciously go, you have no idea how wounded I am.
Yeah.
You have not experienced what I have experienced. You have no idea. It's easy for you to say, I can have a fulfilling life again. You don't know how bad I feel.
Yeah.
And then, people go, oh, I'm sorry. I don't mean to impose on you. Of course, you know, but we don't know. There can be aspects to ourselves that we call the shadow parts. And shadow means we're not aware of them. We're not aware of how much we want the attention, how much we are manipulating other people into a compassion response. It's outside of our awareness. We can't even tolerate the thought we might be doing this. Yeah. So when you then talk to a person and you are suggesting that maybe they are clinging to their trauma and clinging to feeling bad, they're shocked. They're absolutely shocked. So because we have a need to see ourselves as a fair person, a good person, it's very hard to confront your own shadow because by definition, we don't want to be aware of it. And so then when people say, hey, you know, I see you acting in this way, some people feel righteous or feel indignation. How dare you say that about me? I am willing to change, or I am flexible, or I have done my inner work. That's where it gets very, very tricky. There's another example in Caroline's book that stood out for me. She talked about a woman at age 41, she had ovarian cancer. And she was very, very uptight. And she tried hypnosis to get to the root of what it was that was part of having created this particular cancer. And the hypnotherapist could not get her to relax enough to go on into a hypnotic state. So the next time the woman had a massage before the hypnotic session, it went much better. And under hypnosis, she was talking about her fear of aging and men not wanting older women and her tremendous despair over her body aging. So she comes out of hypnosis, and the therapist says to her, you have a fear of aging and you're desperate about your body as a woman. And she said, no, aging is a natural process, and I have no fear of aging. In the next session, the hypnotherapist had some women magazines, and she showed this patient the pictures of these beautiful women. And she asked, do you think these women might be afraid of aging? She said, oh, yes. I mean, if you are making money being a model, of course you are afraid of aging. And the therapist said, you know, do you think that could be your fear? No way. That is fabricated. That's not me. If I had that fear, I would know it. And she stormed out. Right? So change at times also means you have to give up the perceptions you have about yourself, which is difficult to do. This is where people balk and go, no way, I'm not doing this. I'm fair. I'm open-minded. I don't have that. You're just imagining it, or you are projecting it onto me. And the sense of having to be right, wanting to be right, again, is trying to hold together what is perceived as my personality, my identity. And I'm not letting go of that, because that sounds like I could fall apart. Life could become more chaotic. And at least now I know who I am.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you bring up identity, because certainly, you know, in this series, we like to bring science and spirituality together. And so there always seems to be a bridge to that. I feel in almost every interview we've done, whether it's with a quantum physicist, right, a psychotherapist, an artist, it doesn't really matter, even a brain surgeon. And what this makes me think of is identity. And if you think about it, across traditions, across cultures, across time, when you go to a mystery school or you do deep teachings with, you know, the ancient sages from the East, guess where they all start, right? Even in the Tony Robbins master workshop that we did, they start with identity. And I think that, you know, whether you're coming at it from a psychotherapy perspective or coming from a spiritual perspective, the reason I think we start with identity is because we need to move beyond that we are just this, you know. And I think, you know, in spiritual traditions, they'll say, okay, your spirit, your energy, right? You're not this is the perception, the Maya, the illusion. So if we are so much more than this, the physical bag of bones that we like to see ourselves at, and we're just energy beings having this physical experience, you know, you think about it from that perspective, we're spirit, we're energy, and then we're everything else next. So the challenge that I have, and I think many people have on a spiritual path, when you get to that point, is you think, well, I really like my connection to being French. I love saying I'm French because that means, yeah, she cares about food and wine and like fashion and design. And so you kind of get glued to like what you perceive to be a positive part of you. And that could also be your religion. I'm
Mhm.
proud to be Catholic. I'm proud to be Jewish. I'm proud to be Muslim, whatever it happens to be. And then you're in that silo bucket. And then, oh, I'm the teacher, I'm the therapist, I'm the doctor. And so that's another bucket. I'm a mother, I'm a father, and whatever. So we have all these siloed buckets of identities, and some of which we're proud of, and some of which create the trauma, like a Holocaust survivor or what have you. So I'd love to move into this identity and letting go of this identity for greater healing. And you speak about that kind of shocking truth when you go through the therapy and you're showing up, and then you let the person know, well, there's this shadow side, call it shadow, call it trauma, whatever. And healing that shadow is the way to the light. And that's terrifying for people. How do we get there?
So, an important distinction I make is the ego mind identity and the soul identity. I believe that our essence, our soul, is part of universal energy and is eternal. And we learn as kids to identify with the ego mind, that is survival, that is connection with others, that is being seen as valuable, contributing. Those are ego needs that first have to be satisfied in order for a person over time to rise to being more interested in contributing to others, to the welfare of others. So the ego mind is what is generally understood as personality. This is how my patterns, this is where I live, my nationality, what I like, what I dislike. And that is what is typically known. And when we have lost culturally our connection to spirituality, in the old days, you would go to church on Sundays. And even if you weren't believing fully what was being said, you would still hear that there is a soul. That was what the church was talking about. And because of the dogma of the church and religion and so on, many people have left the church. So there isn't really a remembrance of the soul, the energy that is eternal, that has come into this physical body and is here to evolve, to grow, to encounter certain life lessons. And that is why we are here and why we take on this incarnation. So it's interesting to see. I was trained early on in the field of psychedelic psychotherapy. And the biggest aha for me was while I was in a training program in Switzerland in the late 80s, early 90s, that I saw somebody who was a therapist and who had what we call a schizoid disposition, meaning he was not relating to others, closed off, not having a wide emotional range of expression. And after an hour of being on LSD, I asked him, why are you being so angry at your wife? And he would pause, and then he would go, when I'm angry at her, she does X, Y, and Z, and then I do this, and then she leaves me alone. And in that expanded state of consciousness, he could see the pain that they had lived in for over 20 years. And he had tears streaming down his face. He had a full range of emotional expressions that you don't typically see when somebody has a diagnosis of schizoid personality disorder. And I was floored. I was like, oh my God, not only did he have the full range of expression, but also he knew what he was up to.
Yeah.
So the next day is what we call the integration work, which is as important as the expanded awareness moment the day before. And I could see like his thoughts were coming back. Oh, I don't know why I'm doing this. And I looked at my notes and I said, yesterday you said that when you yell at your wife and you show a lot of anger, she pulls away, she apologizes, and then in the end, she leaves you alone. Oh yeah, I said that. And then you were crying over the amount of time that had been wasted between the two of you.
Yeah.
So it's like we are capable of the full soulful expression of consciousness knowing. But thoughts are like clouds that dim the light. So we say, when on a rainy day, we say the sun is not shining. But if you go up with an airplane high enough, the sun is shining. It's just the cloud layer that dims it. So some people have a very thin cloud layer in their lives. Some have a very thick one. And it's not easy to detect as a therapist. So because people, at least here in California, we talk very openly and we're sophisticated and we have the vocabulary. And so sometimes there are people that sound very well adjusted. In a session with psychedelic psychotherapy, what we can see is that the degree of somebody's opening can vary greatly from one person to another. You can never predict how much somebody is allowing for the opening or how much somebody is holding unconsciously the lid on the process. But you can't lie. You either open up and we can see it, or you open the lid a little bit, and that is all other unconscious parts of you will allow. This is where it has been really important when we use the internal family systems approach. We know that there are parts that are protectors that will not allow for something to come to the surface. We also call some parts the exiled parts, the wounded parts that are so hurt, so withdrawn, that the protectors don't even allow them to come in. And so, in a way, using psychedelics in the therapeutic process has allowed us to see how deeply somebody is defended against their own desire to know truth and how much they're holding on.
Yeah.
And it can be very surprising, but you can't lie. You are what you are, and it shows. And you can't make yourself be more open or make yourself be more vulnerable if there are parts that are desperately holding you back and protecting you. And then we have that we can look at, right? And then people go, well, maybe I need a higher dose. Maybe it didn't work for me, or I should use some other medicine. And no, even a higher dose does not bring a greater opening.
But it does bring an opening at a subconscious level that wouldn't otherwise have shown up.
It brings awareness to how much one is holding back. So, for example, in my early days, I had not taken LSD, and I had a friend from Berkeley. He had brought some over. We had made a date on a weekend. Yes, he would be there. He was familiar with LSD for years. And he brought me the book by Ram Dass and Timothy Leary of the 23 bardos that you can experience, meaning the tough places where you can get stuck during an LSD trip. And I studied the book. I had my yellow pad, I had my notes, because I just wanted to glance at my notes. Should I get stuck during an LSD journey? Well, the guy was a great guy, but he was flaky. And he forgot our time. He forgot. So here I was sitting, the candles ready, the music ready. He wasn't showing up. And I called him. He said, oh, he forgot. And I'm like, man, I've put the whole day aside. So I had experienced other substances at that time. So I'm like, I'm fine. I take the LSD because I have my notes. Nothing happened. Nothing. Not a thing. Not a flicker, not a little bit opening. I'd relaxed. Nothing. And 6 hours, 7 hours, nothing. Nothing. So I tried again the next weekend. He was busy. So I'm like, I try that again. Nothing. I called him. I said, nothing happened. Not a thing. It's like not a tiny, tiny opening. And he said, oh my God, this is from our vault in Berkeley. It might have gone bad. Or you are enlightened, because there are stories like Ram Dass, teacher in India, took LSD and felt nothing. Nothing. So he told the community in Berkeley, and they were, my God, what's happening? What's happening? Then somebody said, I don't know what she's doing, but let's invite her over when we are doing a weekend experience, and let's just watch her. So I'm like, okay, I go over there. And being with a group of people, it came on within half an hour. I had a full experience, same LSD. And I realized when I was in high school, the nun said, if you go to a Beatles concert, you might not end up graduating. If you are taking drugs like LSD, you might jump off a balcony. Now, I lived at Oak Creek Apartments on the 3rd floor, and I had a balcony.
Yeah, and the subconscious, too much fear around.
Oh my God. Oh my God. I could not believe it. And that was really important for me to have that experience, to see how powerful the unconscious is, because I was pissed. Like, here I was, I'd studied the 23 bardos. I was so prepared. My conscious mind was going, what the hell is going on? My unconscious said, oh, we are not jumping off the balcony. Survival is more important.
Amazing. That's amazing. And it's a great example of how sometimes experiences happen and sometimes they don't, right? Depending on the environment and the situation and who's in the room or not in the room.
Right. Yeah. So, when Caroline Myss talks about my life is defined by my wounds, what happens is that if somebody, got a physical injury and had, and is disabled, like some amputation was needed or something, there can be the belief that occurs afterwards that my wound defines who I am, defines what my life can be about. And obviously, I am not the same. And the trauma robbed me of my potential to have a great life. Now, people don't walk around saying this out loud, but that is what's going on inside. And we know enough examples of people that, you know, the Boston shooting at the running event, and how people are running with their prosthesis and are having a special marathon these days, overcoming their limitations. But some people believe that their limitations are emotional, mental, and physical limitations. And then a tricky thing happens, because when they feel or believe that I am limited by what has happened to me, they create for themselves the expectation, I can't really be responsible for creating a happy life. Don't expect that of me. And because the expectations are then so low of oneself, one cannot fail. It's very, very seductive.
Yeah.
Because it supports that fear of, you know, if I try, then I could be worse off. I could be more disappointed. And so they don't begin to even explore what is possible.
Yeah, it's almost like, you know, there's this perception of, and I use the word perception purposely, there's this perception of safety over here, and there's this perception of, you know, can't, right, over here. It's too unsurmountable. It's
Right.
too big to overcome. And if they haven't experienced, which is where we started this interview, you talked about the fact that when you were going through the training, and that they hadn't experienced it themselves, and yet they were still, you know, teaching it and doing it for others. If they haven't experienced joy and juice and, you know, this idea that we're whole and complete, you know, there's nothing wrong with us, and they're feeling the juices of the aliveness of being human and spirit, then how can they go there? There's nothing to,
Right.
you know, and I think, I mean, that would be a good sort of final question before we wrap, and just to kind of unpack it a little bit, as MDMA and other experiences, right? Ketamine, and even the increase in popularity of ayahuasca journeys. These are opportunities now for people to open up to these higher states of consciousness and awareness. And you have a lot of experience with that, both for yourself and for others, right? That you've experienced. And so I'm curious what you've seen with that. I mean, there's so much potential here, because when people have felt this pure joy and this bliss, something unlocks to a point where we not just see, but we see, feel, and experience different perceptions. And we've also had a dose of different realities.
Mm-hmm.
So talk to us about that, maybe twofold, and then we'll close. One, your own experiences of how that brought you into these incredible aha moments, and then maybe an example of a client or two where that's happened for them.
Yes. So what we know from the research that MAPS is doing on PTSD and hoping to get FDA approval for the drug MDMA as well as psilocybin now, both MDMA and psilocybin function in the brain that it removes the blood flow from the default program. This is where we hold all the memories of whatever has gone wrong, what we did that was not how we wanted it to be. All these thought patterns are in the default program. So the particular MDMA removes the anxiety of looking at these things and moves the blood flow to the prefrontal cortex. So new vistas are possible on events that we have experienced. We see it in a new light. And the combination of reduced anxiety looking at the trauma with new perspective can bring about a healing. And the awareness that maybe we don't know, maybe there is more that we can experience. Maybe there is more to the story, or maybe the story didn't exactly happen the way we thought it happened. And that is what brings about the change. But here again, some people do not allow even for the potency of the medicine to work in a way that it can work. And they can be very disappointed about the limited experience they have when others are reporting with the same dose a whole different kind of experience. But it's really confronting where we are on the inside and how much we are afraid of change.
Mm. Yeah, that's well said, actually, because, without the intention, it just can't happen. I mean, certainly in spiritual circles, that's the number one thing that they say. If you do not have the intention to open, to go through the enlightenment process, to say, yes, I'm ready for more, I want to do my internal work, it can't happen, because at a soul level, right, we're all here to have a certain kind of experience. And if we're not willing to push beyond that, then that's the experience we're going to have.
Yes, but see, this is where it gets tricky, because people on a conscious level say, yes, I want to change. I'm miserable. I don't like my life. I want to have those experiences of ego dissolution and bliss that the others are having. But on a much deeper level, on the unconscious level, it's a motivational mechanism. We will always move towards what we believe benefits us. Always. And there can be a situation where the benefit of staying small with the familiar seems and appears on that level more beneficial than venturing out into the unknown. And so, in a way, it has to become so painful to be stuck, but you also have to know how stuck you are. That's part of it. It has to become more painful than facing the unknown. Right? Yeah. And people have to go, well, how do I face the unknown? Look, the unknown isn't that unknown. We have had other experiences of joy and excitement. We haven't always been just this confined, limited state of mind. But we discount those moments. Oh, yeah, that was because I was traveling, or that was because I had just fallen in love. No, those moments count, but the pull of staying in that constriction has to become first conscious. Otherwise, you don't know how to tackle it. And that's the difficult part. How do you say to somebody who is unconscious, you are so unconscious? Right? And it's like, who, me? How do you get that across? That's the big question.
Well, as the Buddhists love to say, right, and others say in different words and phraseology, that resistance is futile. So the only way really to get to that place is to go through it. And every time we resist going through what we perceive to be painful, makes it just worse.
Yes. And so I think it's also important that when you are having, for example, a partner who is stuck and is not moving and is not wanting to tackle or look or face what's stuck inside, all the traditions and what we know from our professional experience, only love allows people to change. When you push on them, they don't change. If you are mad at them for being stuck, they don't change. So having compassion for how painful it is to be stuck and how difficult, and that they're not, for the fun of it, staying stuck. There are intense inner protective mechanisms that are at play. And to be aware, to see it, to not deny it, but also to have compassion that this is where the person is. And only when people feel our compassion are they willing to open the door a little bit.
Yeah. Right. The age old, right? Meet them where they're at.
Right. With compassion.
And love.
Yeah, and we have our own reaction to it. You know, we want the person to change. We're going like, how can you be so clinging to the old? So they perceive that as disapproval. And then people close off more.
Yeah.
So it's really understanding how difficult, how nasty it is when you have this unconscious barrier that you're not even quite aware that it's operating in you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, right. There's so many masters who have described this through pyramids and Ken Wilber's work. And, you think about that. So even the chakras, right? From our base sense of security and belonging to, right, the root chakra all the way up. So it's, it's all there in the teachings in different ways. So
Yep. Yeah.
yeah. So with that, are there any final words that you would like to share with people on their spiritual journey who are really bringing science and spirit together from your vantage point?
It's the only voyage that is meaningful to take. Everything else comes and goes. And the ego mind does not create awe, expansion, peacefulness. The ego mind is about survival and procreation. And, Socrates said, know thyself. That's still, I think, the most exciting quest to undertake. And I love it. So.
Know thyself, know thy soul, know thyself, know thy God, but know thyself, know thy goddess, know thyself, know
Yes.
thy I am who I am, right? So, well, with that, this has been a riveting conversation, went in directions I didn't think it was going to take us. So that's always exciting. And we'll let people know on the subsequent pages more about your work and how they can get in touch.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.